No, no, I was going to say next.
So, hi, hello. This is the Clandestine talk. I'm Donna, an historian of philosophy at University of Bologna, and we are broadcasting from the attic of MAMbo Museum, which is hosting this session of the Clandestine talk about the idea of paradox. Pretty strange place, never been here. It really feels like a secret hideout. And I'll tell you more about myself in a minute, but first I want to introduce my three friends and colleagues. So I ask you, each of them, to say a few words about yourself, then I will get back on myself. Siegfried.
I'm Siegfried Zielinski. My passion is the archaeology of media, and I'm also the inventor of a new field of research which I call variantology. Not various ontologies, but variantology, which is about the deep time relations of art science and technologies.
Hi, hello, I'm Audrey Borowski. Sadly, I have no great claim to have invented anything yet, but I've recently published a book on Leibniz and his world, and I'm a research fellow between Germany and England, and I'm currently a visiting fellow at the Edinburgh Futures Institute.
I'm Giovanni Leghissa. I'm a philosopher, a theoretical philosopher. My passion is phenomenology, psychoanalysis. I call them passions. We'll see later why I say that. And that's why I'm here in a certain way, because the question of paradox has a lot to do with the way in how I treat, I'm used to treat philosophical questions.
So thank you. There's a lot I'd like to share with you on this theme, the theme of paradox. Many things came to my mind and connect with the work I've been doing over the last few years in modern and contemporary philosophy. First off, I think of the practice of philosophy itself as something paradoxical, something that crosses the boundaries and the meanings we assign to things, and looks for the problematic field from which concepts takes shape. But more precisely, I believe that paradox has to do with the origin of the meaning itself. And in my short introduction to our talk, I'll try to show you why, from my point of view at least, that origin, the origin of sense or meaning, is indeed paradoxical. The first thing that pops into my head when I think about paradox is the idea of a challenge of one thinking. Paradox is something that invites us to review the very foundations of logic and reality. We could say that, philosophically speaking, paradox is a problematic knot that challenges the laws of coherence and rationality, raising questions about how we construct meaning in the world. So, in this first introduction, I'd like to focus on two 20th century thinkers who placed paradox at the center of their philosophical investigations. The French philosophers Gilles Deleuze and the German sociologist Niklas Luhmann. So let's begin with Gilles Deleuze, who made the paradox one of the keys of his philosophy. There is a work by Deleuze from 1969 called Logic of Sense, Logique du Sens, which is entirely focused on the theme of paradox, to the point that this book presents itself in its very formal structure as a series of paradoxes. Each chapter of the book is dedicated to a specific kind of paradox. So Deleuze does not understand paradox as a contradiction. Paradox is not a contradiction to be resolved, but on the contrary, it thinks of paradox as an element that generates thought. Deleuze compares a philosophical school in this book, an ancient school, a philosophical school of the Stoics, with a modern writer, Lewis Carroll. Since for Deleuze, both these ancient philosophers, the Stoics and Carroll's writings, gave rise in different ways to a theory of sense that has nothing to do with the determination of true and false. For Deleuze, the meaning is, if anything, a surface effect, as he calls it, something that emerges from its opposite, namely nonsense. Now, Deleuze says that Stoics distinguished two types of states: corporeal states relating to matter, and incorporeal or immaterial states relating to the surface effects or sense, as he calls it. So for the Stoics, corporeal states are related to the material and physical dimension of existence. There are the objects, bodies, substances that we can see, touch, measure. Then we have these strange incorporeal states, which are related to the sense dimension. That is, they are like statements or meanings. But these incorporeal states do not belong to the material dimension of the body. They rather belong to the dimension of sense. They are not, let's say that they are not immutable or transcendental essences. They are like forces that pass through the bodies while not being reducible to them. And the body is the place where the tension between what is material and what is immaterial or incorporeal manifests itself. So in a word, we could say that the body is like the surface involved in the creation of sense. It is the place where the difference between the corporeal and incorporeal, the material and immaterial, merge in a continuous flow of sense. And all this implies that sense is paradoxical, because in every form of communication, it is never given as such. To take Spinoza's theory of substance as an example, which lends itself quite well to the purposes of a critique of the standard theory of communication, sense is always conceived in something else. It is always modalized, like the relation between substance and modes, is always modalized in something else. And this also implies that meaning is always in excess of any theory that claims to formalize it. So, we have bodies and meanings, and the latter are paradoxical entities, because they traverse bodies without being in them. Deleuze says that meaning is never reducible to the signified things itself, but rather functions like a threshold. What is a threshold? A threshold, as cats who hesitate to cross them well know, are very special entities, very strange entities. They cannot even be called entities. Thresholds are not really something, but they are what makes possible an orientation in a space. Deleuze opposes a metaphysics of substances, essences, the Aristotelian framework, to a metaphysics of a logic or a metaphysics of paradoxical events, so to speak. The event is like a threshold that consists in an act of distinction between an inside and an outside, a distinction that cannot itself be identified. So we could say that thresholds have a transcendental character, as we say in philosophy. Their virtue is to generate an experience by disappearing from the perceptual level. Indeed, our faculties, our natural faculties, our faculties in their empirical use, so to speak, cannot locate a threshold. The threshold is the boundary line between an inside and an outside, but the line it draws is entirely abstract or neutral. This is why By the way, this is why Deleuze honors the term abstract. In his lectures on Kant, Deleuze argues that true living is absolutely abstract. The abstract of which Deleuze speaks is the paradox of pure becoming. We find it in Difference and Repetition, Différence et Répétition, in an essay on Bergson, in the second volume of his writings on cinema, when Deleuze thematizes the so-called image crystal, that is the image that in films of Robert Bresson, Alain Resnais, the late Pasolini, presents time immediately without passing through movement. So the paradox of the pure becoming is the threshold that is never, when you look for it, that is missing in its place. It is the trauma from which the thought Plato speaks of in the Parmenides originates. In the same way, Alice in Carroll's novel does not grow without shrinking. She's a singularity that relates to the paradox of pure becoming. And this pure becoming is the matrix of sense, according to Deleuze. Deleuze then writes, while common sense is the instance that identifies, that recognizes. The paradox is the nonsense, I quote, of lost identity. And this is here, in my view, that Deleuzian thought enters into connection with systems logic. And as I shall attempt to show you, in particular with another logic based entirely on the concept of paradox, which is that of Niklas Luhmann. In fact, to the same paradox of meaning refers the logic of systems. Think of the German sociologist Niklas Luhmann or another French philosopher, Michel Serres, who conceived the paradox in relation to the so-called theory of the observer. Niklas Luhmann starts from the premise that social reality is composed of autopoietic social systems, as he calls it. That is, systems that self-organize through communication. So the observer, in Luhmann's framework, is a position from which the system observes itself and its interactions with the environment. The paradox arises from the fact that every observation implies a distinction, the separation between what is observed and what is not. But every act of observation implies an internal distinction that is paradoxical, since the observer can never observe from the outside, but is always embedded within the system being observed. Thus, every observation is inherently self-referential. In Luhmann's framework, observation is always a circular process. We could say from this perspective that sense is like the blind spot. The blind spot that functioning at the bottom of vision cannot itself be the object of vision. And similarly, George Spencer Brown, in his work Laws of Form, proposes a mathematical model of distinction based on the concept of re-entry. That is the idea that a distinction, while separating two words, loops back into itself and creates a sort of circularity. So re-entry occurs since a distinction is never outside the system, it divides, but is always inclusive of the system that produces it. Thus, for all these authors, the statute of sense is paradoxical, for it is missing in its place. Sense is the differential or the act of distinction that generates forms, yet without possible representation, depiction. This is also what Wittgenstein meant in the Tractatus, when he said that an image makes sense insofar as it shows a state of affairs that can be true or false, but for something to be able to depict something else and thus have a Bedeutung, something identical must be given between the two states of affair, and this identity cannot be arranged on the empirical level, but functions as a transcendental proposition that is the form of depiction. So we could also say that the encounter with something is always the encounter with the transcendental past of something, on which Giovanni, Leghissa, also builds his idea of the encyclopedia as the pure past or infinite sense on which all possible meanings depends. Thus, the point is not to logically resolve the paradox, but on the contrary, to step outside formal logic and declare that the origin of any form of objective knowledge is nonsensical. Luhmann implies the Gorgon's myth metaphor to introduce the observer's paradox and the possibility of, so to speak, resolving it. He uses the term deparadoxisation, Entparadoxierung. According to the myth, Perseus' strategy consists in not looking directly at the Gorgons, but instead reflecting their images, as Perseus does, using the mirror-like shield given to him by Athena. And similarly, the French philosopher Michel Serres introduces this strange figure of the parasite. Who is the parasite? The parasite is a philosophical character describing a third position between two communicating partners. The parasite is a figure that interrupts, diverts, or modifies the flow of communication. It's a strange figure that, how I could say, that disturbs the order, but at the same time is essential for communication because it cannot be reduced to a simple interference. But exemplifies this dynamic between the observed and the observer, between separation and inclusion. The parasite is the paradox of the excluded third, the kind of event that Gilles Deleuze spoke about, one that cannot be fully identified, yet drives the entire communicative chain. So, these are the first thoughts I'd like to share with you about the nature of paradox, which, as I've tried to show, is not an obstacle to philosophy, but rather, we could say, is the ground from which thought itself emerges, and which shouldn't be solved, since the meaning of something is always preceded by sense, and sense, as we have said, is always in excess, except within the framework of a limited system of a partial encyclopedia, as Umberto Eco would have said. Referring back to Luhmann, then I would say that philosophy's task is not to resolve, to solve paradoxes, but rather to engage with them, that is to grapple with the origin of communication without being petrified by the gaze of Medusa. So, Siegfried, if you...
Isn't Deleuze's logic of sense written in confrontation with Francis Bacon?
Not really.
Because the title of the book, which he published later, Francis Bacon, is in German at least, Logik der Sensation. So I know that this is an essay, but my question was more if Deleuze already was dealing with Francis Bacon, which I think, because the book came much later.
Don't think so, or rather Deleuze deals with everything at the same time. But the focus of Logique du Sens are Artaud and Lewis Carroll and the Stoics. These are the three main conceptual characters. And Duns Scoto.
Scoto, okay.
Late scholastic, yes.
Okay. Yeah, no, thanks a lot.
For the concept of, echeitas, which is a sort of synonymous of event, this strange surface effect that, that surfaces bodies, states of things, etc. So, the idea of singularity as something that cannot be objectified.
Which is a level within which both God and humans are put together in a certain way.
In a Spinozian way.
Yes, it's precedent, of course.
I would like to come back later in the discussion on one very important point in your presentation, and this is the idea or the concept that you cannot be at the same time inside and outside of a system. This is a classical, physical, mechanical thought, but if you look at quantum physics, of course, you have a completely different picture. These philosophers and those thinkers who were thinking that, they were a little bit late in constructing their idea of the observer, because quantum physics and quantum mechanics was present in philosophy latest in the 20s and in the 30s. I just would like to mention a wonderful scholar, Max Bense. We talked about him quickly, a German philosopher and informatic guy from the 1930s, 40s, 50s. He wrote a beautiful essay, 1948, on technical existence, which starts with a sentence. I have this sentence always in my mind and in my heart. I can quote it even if you wake me up in my dreams. 1948, our existence has become basically technical.
Yeah.
1948, after the Second World War. This was a statement. This was a clear statement, and he wrote his dissertation on Daseinsrelativität, the relativity of being. This was a kind of an attempt to integrate philosophical thinking with quantum mechanics. 1936, I think, was the date of the dissertation. It only exists, of course, in German, but you can find it in the internet. It's completely stored there. So thank you very much, Diego.
If I may add something to this point, it took really a long time before the scientific community as a whole, including philosophers, could become aware of the philosophical, metaphysical importance of quantum physics. Even among the physicists who created this new frame of thought, it was not so easy to grasp and to realize the innovation created by quantum physics. Niels Bohr was the first one who told to his colleagues, Dirac, Schrödinger, and so on, look, what are we doing here? We are involved in our own theory, and we must take account of it. We must account for this fact, which is a new fact. And the others, this doesn't matter, this is philosophy. No? But it is interesting, in the same time in which Husserl tried to construct his own theory, within which the position of the subject is so important. In the same time, at the beginning of the 30s, you find only Niels Bohr who was able to understand the metaphysical meaning of quantum. And later, Merleau-Ponty, in his lessons given at the Collège de France, on the title Nature, he showed very clearly why only phenomenology, namely a theory acquainted with paradoxes, was able to construct a philosophical frame of what physicists, the physics theory was trying to do.
And so be able to problematize the position of the subject.
The position of the subject. This is why paradoxes are so important for us. No?
From a methodological point of view.
Yes.
Yeah. Now this is, we can perhaps later discuss a little bit more about it, but I think this is very important also for the arts. We are here at an art museum. I remember very well when I started to move into what is called media arts in the 70s and in the 80s. There was a strong change of paradigm, which is touching what you were just talking about. The change of paradigm was that you suddenly, so to speak, could be as an observer, as a visitor of a museum inside of the art piece. This was called interactive art. You were going inside of the art piece, and not only that, you had the possibility to change the artwork while you are inside of it. So this was the construction of two observers, one active one, which goes inside and plays with the things, becomes part of the system, and outside, the distant view, the observer view. When, of course, I'm a media archaeologist, when you go back in history, you find, for example, this miraculous book by Athanasius Kircher from 1645, 1646. These were the 2 years where it was published, and one of his many constructions was a room, a space, in which you went as an observer. You were confronted with a drum which was carrying mirrors. And so when you entered the room, at first you saw yourself in the mirror, and then the drum was moving by a hand outside, God's hand outside of the black box, and there was another mirror on the top which was projecting images of heads of animals, a lion's head and so on. And suddenly your head was substituted through a lion's head. I call it the metaphorical machine or allegorical machine. Perhaps this is a better pronunciation. So this whole idea of playing with the inside and the outside observer in the arts and of course also in thinking plays an important role. I'm not so much trained as an academic philosopher as you are, but if I look, for example, on Giordano Bruno's work from 1600, I can see that very clearly, and this is a proximity in time with Athanasius Kircher and for example, or people like Giovanni Battista della Porta in Napoli. Of course. So this is a very interesting thing, and to make it very clear. I mean, I discussed these kind of subjects a lot with physicists and scientists because one of my friends is a very famous chaos theoretician and a physicist. He's called Otto Rössler. He is the inventor of what is called endophysics. This is the physics of the inside, the smallest things, opposite to exophysics, which is usually the object of the academic established physics. And he always said to me when we had discussions on what quantum physics and quantum mechanics is, he said, Siegfried, if anybody tells you that he is not mad when he is a quantum physics, don't believe him, then he's not a quantum physicist. So we are very close to your ideas of the paradox. This kind of reality which quantum physics constitutes and which it constructs in relation to the observer or the observers, to be possible to be at two places at the same time and all these kind of things. This is the stuff which is of course not worrying us now, but makes us nervous, and this is great because then we start to think. When the machines become hot, we start to think, and it gets more interesting. This is
what you said about art.
Yeah.
The way the object of art becomes part of this mirroring.
Absolutely.
The art itself becomes an observer.
Yeah, this is one thing, and don't underestimate the epistemological values of art. I'm already in my introduction, so to speak. I made this very clear decision to leave the Technical University of Berlin around 1989 and decided to work in the context, in the framework of art schools and academies. Of course, there was an obvious reason, because the amount of freedom you have in such a school, especially when you can found it by yourself. I founded an art school by myself, which was dedicated to the relations of art, science and technology, so I could do everything what I really liked. But the very important thing is that artists are these sensors, these deep sensors, these seismographs, through which they anticipate things which sometimes much later are articulated in sciences and in philosophy. And this is very interesting. So I could in my media archaeology, I could make a very clear expertise about this outside and inside observers. I can even go back to the early Islamic automaton culture, 800, 900, where they were playing already with this kind of two observers. This is extremely, so it does also not come from modernity, from Christian modernity or European modernity. It comes from much deeper grounds of civilization. But this is a very interesting point. To introduce myself with another sentence, I asked ChatGPT last night, ChatGPT-4, what Zielinski is doing, and it said that Zielinski does not see...
Cannot answer.
Zielinski does not see media history as a linear development of technical devices, but rather as a history of divergent forms of thought and memory. Extelligences, they quote, superior intelligence, in brackets, play a central role in this. What we cannot or do not want to keep in our heads, we store in machines. This is just a short quote of a longer text, which is I said, okay, I can do with that. We can make something. We can make something out of that. So
you even mention intelligence. That is your key. One of your key concepts.
My kind of thinking, the archaeology of media, and also the archaeology of arts, because this is strongly connected for me, is very, very much dealing with paradoxes. I would say that it's grounding my everyday work. Why? Because on the one hand, as an archaeologist interested in the arts, I'm confronted with Einbildungskraft, with imagination, with the energy and the power of fantasy. And on the other hand, when it comes to technical media, I'm confronted with systems of order, of grammar, highly structurized systems. And this is a tension which is permanently animating my thoughts and my everyday praxis. So if you work in this field as an archaeologist, which is also, of course, a kind of a paradoxon, we can discuss that later, you are confronted with this kind of challenges permanently. I make it a little bit more concrete, perhaps, and try to formulate this tensionship between the technological and the imaginative, the imagination, in 3 or 4 points. Neurologically, I learned from those who come from neurosciences that the brain is constructed analog to this idea of tensionship very strongly as the tensionship between the systems of chaos and order, the systems of censorship and fantasy, which tries to open up the borderlines of the censorship, the tensionship between discipline or disciplinization and the liberation, which tries to get rid of the grammatical structures of the high orders and so on. Aesthetically, which is very strongly also my field, the organization of crossing borders in relation to conventions and aesthetical rules plays a very important role for everybody who is dealing seriously with art. Creative energy means the ability to transgress the finiteness of our existence into a more open pluriverse. Trasumana e organiza. You know who said that? To transcend and to organize. With this beautiful formula and the evocation of a complementary harmony of diversity, Pasolini describes an essential dimension of his work as a poet and as a director. This formula can also be interpreted as a paradox. With the slight shift, one then writes, as far as I know Italian, with a slight shift, one then writes and understands organizzare il trasumana, which means to organize the crossing of boundaries. To organize the crossing of boundaries. That's a wonderful and beautiful paradox for me, because they are, it sounds like an antagonism, but of course we permanently try to make it a contradiction, which we can solve somehow. This is apt as in one of Pasolini's central intentions. Media theoretically,
which might be read like structuring the disorder.
something like that. Something like
The reverse.
Yeah.
Back to Luhmann again. No?
Yes, again.
Yeah. I'm not a luminist, I must admit, but...
No, we know.
Okay, we can discuss later. Then a third moment would be the media theoretical thing or access. As I mentioned already several times, I not only introduced archaeology as a conscious alternative also to Michel Foucault's idea of an archaeology of knowledge. The four-syllable, the pre-an gives me the freedom. I construct archives which are not constructed or which are not containers under the hegemony of power, but which follow, for example, artistic perspectives or artistic views. The containers of knowledge and things, which I call archives, don't claim for power. They don't need leadership and they don't claim for power. These terms, leadership and power, which are so strongly inside of the archives, which Foucault only used in the plural. By the way, in a very late, which I found very late, at least in a very late lecture Foucault gave in Paris, he also was thinking about the term archaeology, expressis verbis, and introduced this idea of an archive or archaeology, but he said I was not brave enough to really use it at the time when I wrote the books which we all know, and this is a very interesting point. It's quite because everybody, and he says that in this short text in his own comment, everybody would think he's an anarchist. He's an anarchist, you know,
definitely.
and they don't take me serious anymore. This Foucault did not want that. He wanted to be taken seriously. So this is a very interesting
Even though I
point.
think that this idea of a sort of disorder or something, as he calls it, des objets hétéroclites, who corrupts, who works from within the order, is already present in the 1966, in the archaeology, in the world, and
it's present, but it's not articulated
Yeah,
expresses that's the point. Okay, from this point, but we have no time to explore that closer. I constructed a research field which I enjoy a lot, and which is also full of paradoxes. This is prospective archaeology. An archaeology which is not looking back, which is not retrospective, but prospective. I give you an example, because we are again here in an art museum and we have to be concrete. We have to talk about particularities and not only about concepts. For example, a gang of Arabian engineers, very young engineers, constructed an automaton, a musical automaton in 850. And this automaton was already programmable. I found out about this after, of course, a long research and investigations. Finally, I managed through a friend in Beirut to get hold of the manuscript of the manual, which was, of course, a copy of a copy of a copy, but we were able to read it, to translate it, and to read it as a manual with which you can build the machine. And that's what we did. That's what I did with my students, and this is what I call prospective archaeology. We read the manuals, and then we built, not rebuilt, we built this machine again. And the students learned what algorithmic thinking is in a very deep sense, not connected with a computer, which is a very late development, but the algorithmic thinking is much older, of course, and they learned what algorithmic thinking was in the 9th century, and in a culture, the Arabic Islamic culture, which they only knew through terrorists and through everything. You know, it was a huge surprise, and now this object, I'm very happy about that, is standing in the Museum of the Ars Electronica in Linz, and the ZKM has also a copy. So this is what I call prospective archaeology. I did that in several cases, also with younger objects, historically younger objects. But there again you dive into deep time of history, which usually is connected with the ideas and the principles of an archaeologist. But then in the same movement, you don't stop the movement in the past. You carry on, and then you land in the present and in a possible future. This is the point. It's a time machine which I'm trying to organize with this kind of prospective archaeology, and this means, of course, this is completely paradox. And I enjoy that a lot because it's a playful invention. I can do a lot of things with that. So that helps a little bit, perhaps, to make clear why I'm so much let's say affiliated with this subject, with this theme. I'm doing this kind of things, and this is another thing I really would like to mention. I'm doing this kind of research, this kind of organizing conferences, making books around this subject within a framework which I call economy of friendship. Mm-hmm. Again, a huge paradox. Economy and friendship. You know, as soon as friendship becomes something economical, useful, and you can use the other or whatever, it's the end of all kind of friendship.
Spinoza thought of friendship like a sort of utilitas. He spoke of utilitas.
Okay.
So
this is of course deeply wrong. This is deeply wrong for me, at least. I follow Georges Bataille.
That's
some other thinkers who say friendship is the common feeling of being alien in this world.
Yeah.
And this is what I'm talking about. This is the ground for our conferences and for our meetings, which I do with people from all over the world. We share this alienness with our passions. We share this alienness, and this is motivation enough for people from Beirut, from Tokyo, or wherever they come from, to come to a place like Berlin or wherever we are, or to Naples. I organized conferences in Naples, in the National Library, which is one of my favorite libraries, and we discuss the things we like to discuss. So, economy of friendship is an extremely important motivation for me, and a deep paradox in the everyday activities. We can do that further on in the discussion. I could dive into the arts themselves and discuss various artists who are working regarding at least the tensionship between art, science, and technology with these paradoxical ideas. One of the most prominent is Namjoon Paik, the so-called father of video art, which is a silly expression. But he said a wonderful sentence in an interview. I study technology in order to be able to hate it better or to criticize it better. That's a beautiful paradox construction, and perhaps it's not even paradox. It's just a logic which follows the logic of the particularities of the things, of the objects, which I like a lot. You are not only looking at them, you go deep inside of them. This is why I wrote this dissertation on the history of video recording. I wanted to go as deep as possible into this artifact, into this system, into this technical system, to really find out what it is, not only technically, but also culturally, philosophical, an audiovisual time machine. But that's a long story. So this is, in Pike, you can find a hell lot of paradoxes in his work. Moon was the first TV and all these kind of things, but you can also discuss or study work of Panamarenko, for example. Panamarenko is one of the artists who works in the tradition of the bachelor machines, machine célibataire in French. Yeah. The bachelor machines, the inventing all kinds of functioning things, precise functioning things, but which are not useful. This is beautiful. It follows the ideas of Jarry and the pataphysicists of the late 1910s and 1920s. The pataphysics are, of course, pataphysics. I mean, this is a paradox par excellence. So there are in media arts you can find a lot of these kind of inventors and crazy engineers who are working with these kind of things. Perhaps I wrote that down because I have to be very precise in this case. One of the most well-known machines, which you can call a paradoxical machine, is Marvin Minsky's very well-known machine, which he called Leave Me Alone box. Audrey definitely will know it. In 1952, Marvin Minsky was a doctoral student at Bell Labs, and through him, Claude Shannon, he was mentioned yesterday, came up with the idea of a completely useless machine in their conversations. The apparatus fascinated him so much that he adapted it, so Marvin Minsky adapted it without further ado as an ultimate machine and built a model for his own philosophical and poetological pleasure. Only for himself. He did not do that for exposure and to show it to others. It represents the briefest and at the same time most ironic technical objectification of the two machine states on and off. On and off. This was long before there was any theory of digitality or something like that. Shannon also called it the Leave Me Alone box. How does it work? I brought on my computer also images and so on, so I could show it to you because we exhibited this machine some years ago. A metal toggle switch is mounted on the surface of a small wooden box, which can be set to either the on or the off position. Mm-hmm. If I intervene in the idle resting position, off, by flipping the switch to the on position, a lid embedded in the surface of the box opens automatically. A small metal hand pushes out of the hollow space and flips the switch back to the off position. The lid closes again as a result of this movement. The all-purpose nature of digital computers, Johann von Neumann, is poetically alienated. The only purpose the machine pursues is to turn itself off when it is activated. This is a beautiful example for this permanent paradoxes when you are moving through high technology, through advanced technologies. You leave, of course, the the two realms, the separated realms of the material things and the metaphysical. They are both very closely intertwined, and they become something through which you have to go as a passage, as a passenger, permanently. Peter Weibel, by the way, with whom I worked a lot and made some exhibitions, also including this one with Claude Shannon's piece, made a beautiful performance in 1967. This was extremely early, where he played in the same way with an audio recorder. He was sitting in the streets of Berlin with a normal audio tape recorder, and he pressed the on button of the recorder and said on, and then the recorder answered off, and he said on again, and the recorder answered off again, and he did that for hours and hours. He introduced that he was very favorite of Lacan's psychoanalysis at that time, with an introduction to Lacan and Lacan thinking, and he said, I'm doing this as long as I do not break together or the machine breaks together. And this again was a kind of an anticipation of a theory of digitality, which did not exist at that time in 1967. So it was an artist's statement and an artist's anticipation. So basta, I don't say anymore.
And this idea of a closed box is very Lacanian, which is a sort of metaphor of the unconscious, in a way.
Absolutely, yeah.
In a time in which Lacan was much interested and attracted by cybernetics.
Yes.
During the 60s. Yeah.
Well,
trying to mathematizing
the
unconscious as.
Yeah. Yeah.
shared metaphors, to talk about the brain, the mind, and the computers and the various networks, from which actually many paradoxes, since we don't have the appropriate tools to talk about digitality, computing, and so on, probably emerge. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well,
Audrey.
After a more philosophical and artistical foray, maybe I dive a bit more deeply and into more practical matters and paradoxes, little paradoxes in AI, how I see them. Maybe just a few points which I think might be interesting for us to meditate, and which will help us precisely gain a more transcendent view on the systems in which we are immersed on a day-to-day basis, which I think is a huge problem these days. I mean, first of all, we are building systems that we don't comprehend, and this is not an original point. It's been mentioned by Günther Anders, Hannah Arendt, Hans Blumenberg. We are using on a daily basis systems whose mechanisms are obfuscated. We've just mentioned the black box. Are these systems intelligent? Artificial intelligence. I mean, actually, it turns out that today the Turing test, the famous Turing test, whereby a machine could be deemed intelligent if it managed to simulate human intelligence, according to Turing in the 1950s, seems to have been debunked by ChatGPT and various other systems. But, are we really dealing with intelligence here? We're in a situation now where we have bots pretending to be humans, and humans having to behave like automata, and increasingly, like bots, pretending to be human in some cases, which could be deemed as the summum of paradox. ChatGPT, far from manifesting a machinic consciousness, actually peddles in simulacrum and mimicry with little regard for truth, actual intelligence, or judgment. So we rely on these systems that actually end up flattening our horizons of meaning, organize our cognitive de-skilling, and, in the words of Stigler, have succeeded in bypassing the deliberative functions of the mind. Now, a supreme paradox of today in our, the term excess has been very, which is a key word, in fact. And Diego, you were talking about thresholds and excess, and I think this is an absolutely key word. You know, we live in an ecosystem of data overload, data overabundance, deluge of data, if I'm to quote Calude and Longo, surplus data in the terms of Leif Weatherby, Patrick Yagoda, and so on. And so, but actually this overabundance of data, which we were sold as helping us clarify, gaining more knowledge, helping us, you know, gain a better grip on our lives and progress, you know, fit very nicely in this great narrative of progress, has not actually led to better informed judgments or deeper understanding of the world, but has had the opposite effect. We are overwhelmed. It has rendered the production of truth challenging, if not, paradoxically, actually a moot point. This deluge of data, a consequence of the ubiquitous deployment of digital systems meant to comfort our mastery over the world, has in fact deepened our current epistemological crisis. And here I'm thinking of the artist, Peter Steil, who writes that under the new regime of big data, veracity is no longer produced by verifying facts. You know, too much data kills data. Not to mention that in our current regime of infinite stream of daily dose of data, categories, taxonomies, various systems of ordering, you know, we mentioned Bacon earlier on, that were an invention, a huge invention, especially of the early modern period, have been erased and all information and content is leveled. So in the words of a famously uttered by Mark Zuckerberg, you know, a deluge, a tsunami is as important as a video of a squirrel on Facebook. So we live in a bizarre, some might say, distorted reality. Data, information, and facts pale in comparison to ideas, values, frames, ideologies, increasingly in highly disorienting and uncertain times. And, you know, with that, the more we have technologies of communication, the actually lonelier and more isolated we are. This goes with this. This surfeit of information seems also to be fostering, as we know, social divisions, distrust, conspiracy theories, post-factual politics, while reducing our agency in the world and preventing us from coming together and forging shared, meaningful worlds. And I'm thinking here, you know, since we have touched on it, but we haven't really mentioned it explicitly, rationality and the kind of rationality that is operating in many of these systems. And, you know, especially machine learning systems. I'm thinking here of the very famous Chris Anderson provocation of 2008 in Wired. You know, these systems infer correlations rather than causal links. You know, they predict, they speculate from data sets, you know, past data sets. And as I argue that actually many of these systems bear striking similarities to mythic thought. You know, we've had a big return of the mythic thought, forms of thinking, in fact. Today's technological, algorithmic world has in many respects ushered in a new form of absolutism. Here I'm paraphrasing Hans Blumenberg, threatening to form new totalizing images to tame the future and avoid the unpredictable. And at the conference, you know, you mentioned crisis of expertise, and the fact, you know, we mentioned, we thought about the fact that we are no longer, governments, experts are never allowed to simply state that they do not know. You know, we are not allowed uncertainty. There is no tolerance for uncertainty, you know, and this is a big part of the equation here. And especially a mythical nature of how these algorithms operate, generally drawing on past data. And we are led to another paradox, which consists in the fact, you know, return of myth and return of gnosis, you know, the idea that a true, real reality lurks beneath the material reality, and a new form of metaphysics, the return of metaphysics. Knowledge does not pre-exist massive data, but continuously emerges from it, even as its ground is constantly shifting like rapid sands. I think Antoinette Rouvois says, reality is always there, imminent to the databases waiting to be discovered by statistical algorithmic processes. So over the past few years, these systems have crossed a threshold as they have been hailed as being uniquely apt, especially compared to humans, at revealing truths hidden within the data. And here we can see very easily, very quickly, the theological, metaphysical dimension of all of this impulse. In fact, it's part of a broader narrative which sees humans as, these flawed, horrible creatures, who should be ashamed to have been born. If I'm thinking here of Günther Anders, we are encouraged to defer our decision-making as well as more efficient management of our lives to algorithmic systems on the misconception that they will help steer the course of our lives in supposedly more optimized and rationalized ways, whatever that is. Another paradox. What is, optimization, rationality? These are never defined, especially if they happen to fit our individual world views. These tools cross over to shaping reality itself through preemption. They are no longer descriptive but prescriptive, helping generate and enforce particular futures upon the world from the past. So, we are entering, in many respects, a weird doppelganger, and I'm thinking here of Naomi Klein, very relevant, excellent book. A warped vision. We have reality, and then these various mirrorings, of reality. How do all of these versions and perspectives of reality fit in together? And how can we, transcend our various perspectives to reach a new transcendent? That is the question I am currently working on. So our report to the world is increasingly powerfully mediated by various interfaces and frames that we select or are selected for us. Hannah Arendt talks about the logic of an idea. Crucially, they drive the current epistemological and political crisis. They constitute the perfect mechanism through which ideas and worldviews are transmuted into social facts. Unoriginally, we live in filter bubbles, these famous filter bubbles, echo chambers in our subjective realities, which breed simultaneously dogmatism and relativism. These two coexist simultaneously, in the words of Thomas Bauer. Another paradox here, especially in a context of socio-economical, political, and cultural crisis, and what is perceived as the loss of meaningful worlds. We are promised individualizing results, while these systems actually increasingly peddle standardized visions of the world and ways of life and homogenize its contents. We are also provided with the illusion of agency, while our public realms are depoliticized and we are further atomized and isolated. Social platforms in particular are particularly good at encouraging a mentality of outrage that loops on itself indefinitely. Expressivity and volubility on social networks seem to be uniquely matched by our inaction in the real world. Social technologies, we were sold the idea, from the 18th century and especially 19th century and 20th century that social technologies, letter writing, telegraph, newspapers, and so on, would be a panacea, that it would help, promote tolerance, bring people together, promote peace, democracy, and we can trace this idea, in fact, to Leibniz. But as Fred Turner and Nicholas Carr have once again shown, that this does not follow at all, and we are actually in the paradoxical situation where these new social technologies have, in fact, produced the very opposite. Another huge paradox is the environmental question. Despite operating in a virtual space, AI in the cloud have considerable tangible effects. They are not, in any respect, really virtual. The abstractness or disembodiedness of the cloud is an illusion that conceals a deeply material structure. I'm thinking minerals, resources, exploitation, huge energy consumption from production, transport, operations, and end-of-life stages. And not to mention that AI is increasingly facing an energy crisis, considering the exponential energy costs and the bizarre, paradoxical, and I want even to go further to the term absurd situation where because of data centers, certain villages and certain cities in the world are being deprived of water because the water has to be funneled over to cool down data centers.
It was a big discussion when Tesla founded his the factory in Berlin, because there were a lot of protests against it, because the electronic car production is using an enormous amount of the deep
Absolutely.
water.
Absolutely. And each time you do a ChatGPT request, in fact, it's half a bottle of water that goes. Just some things to think about. And So we are willing to sacrifice the earth and the very material. Diego talked about the tension, and I was really thinking about AI then, material, immaterial. AI is the perfect case study for that. We're willing to sacrifice the earth for grand fantasies and still largely empty promises. We are incinerating the earth in the name of a higher intelligence. It's, a form of digital God. And this is a major problematic at the moment, how we cleave on to new forms of abstractions, new ideals of AI as opposed to reality. We are sacrificing the materiality of the world in the name of hypothetical immaterial vision, and overall perpetuating, worsening a way of life which is actually leading us to our doom. And, starting to wrap up here, another paradox is that, the algorithmization of societies, have led us to fluid, frictionless realities with everything at our fingertips, potentially, and yet we are more unhappy, lonely, discontented than ever before. We were told that we are told every day, in fact, that we are living a momentous historical moment, a revolution in accelerating times, and especially in precarious times of radical change. But are we really experiencing such a revolution and such radical changes? Or are we really more mired into a constant crisis that fails to find a solution, a critique, a new transcendent vision? Algorithmic systems drive these crises, even as they present themselves as convenient and easy solutions to them. They help preserve a pernicious status quo and state of uncertainty, calling for always more technology to the ills, ironically, paradoxically, they play a significant part in further exacerbating. These systems, in fact, seem to be built on crisis, one that seems to turn on itself indefinitely which never finds a solution, horizon, or new vision, and actually affords very little genuine resilience in time in which the whole framing of society tells us that we live in times of chaos, uncertainty, and precarity. So we are mired further in what has become a continuous crisis, a speculative bubble. Digital systems and structures not only occur against a background of deepening political, epistemological, economical, and social crisis, they actually compound and drive it. So, the system, we are in the paradox in some respects. For all the rhetoric of constant change, little actually, arguably, really changes. We are racing to nowhere in a movement without end or purpose, for empty promises, in the name of empty promises and grand fantasies, which vie primarily for the preservation of the status quo, generates only variations of itself, and ultimately just accrues more crisis. The ensuing paralysis further comforts us in our powerlessness, inaction, and our reliance on those very systems. So, we are supporting effectively and heightening the current neoliberal momentum which continues to exploit and mistreat large swaths of mankind and depletes and devastates the planet. And finally, these systems are actually in a way leading us to our doom, because they encourage us to continue, they are simply going headlong towards catastrophe in the name of erecting potentially a hypothetical future world order in which rid of humans and their horrible flaws. And we have to wonder, perhaps, we have to meditate what could be construed as a nihilistic impulse behind this this particular kind of AI that has been imposed on us.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Audrey. Lots of questions, but maybe Giovanni,
yes,
you want to add something now?
Okay, well, there is not so much left to be said.
There's a lot.
But,
This is a coquette remark.
No, I meant it honestly. Let me come back to Niklas Luhmann.
Great.
And then I'll try to explain you why it is so important for me as a philosopher to deal with his way of dealing with paradoxes. And in the end, I'll try to explain why it is possible, perhaps, this is my dream, if you want, but I highlight it, perhaps, this must be highlighted. It is possible to construct a sort of utopia, not in the political sense, but more in the sense of friendship. No? We were talking about previously, sort of hidden community, unpolitical on the one hand and paradoxically very political on the other hand, a sort of community of people who share the idea that paradoxes are important for good life, for the welfare of mankind in a certain way. But let me repeat what Diego already told us about Luhmann's theory concerning paradoxes. There is no logic of paradoxes. This is the first point.
Original kind of logic.
I mean, yeah, that's the point. If you want to construct a logic of paradoxes, the first thing you have to deal with, the first thing you have to acknowledge is that logic, what we usually mean with logic, is a way of issuing paradoxes. No? It's, logic has been created in a certain way precisely in order to deny the existence of paradoxes, or at least to make them unharmful, no? In a certain way. On the other hand, and quite on the contrary, better, Luhmann says that paradoxes are unavoidable, and moreover, he tries to explain us why a good theory must be based precisely on paradoxes. But when and why paradoxes arise, the answer is very simple in a certain way, and in this sense very logical, if you want. Paradox has to do with the fact that an observer cannot observe himself or herself or itself, if we deal with intelligent systems who pretend to be intelligent, at least, who are perceived as if they were intelligent. So that's why I say it. So an observer cannot observe him, her, itself. He can only see what he, she, it sees, but he, she, it cannot see himself, itself, herself, seeing what he, she, it sees. What remain unseen by an observer, by any sort of observer, by any kind of observer, is precisely the unity made up of the observer and the observed world. This unity can be observed only by a second-order observer. And on the other hand, this is the most important thing here within this issue, there is no third-order observer. The second-order observer who observes the first-order observer is not able to observe himself, herself, itself. No? He can be observed only by another second-order observer who takes into consideration, who observes the first, what becomes for him, for her, for it, the second-order observer who observes another first-order observer. That's the point. This is the paradox.
That's why medieval needed God.
Yes. And this is why Luhmann was so fond of Nicholas of Cues' philosophy. Exactly. Because he said that even if theology has nothing to do with modernity, and in this sense, let me highlight it, this is a very important point for me. Precisely here, I see a big similarity between Luhmann's philosophy and Blumenberg's philosophy. Both authors can really help us understand why modernity implies a coupure, a real interruption, a break with regard to what came before. Modernity is the first cultural tradition meant in the sense of cultural anthropology, as if we were a tribe, so to say. The first tribe of people made of people who share the idea that there is no God, so that there is no observer external, which is posed externally to the system within which any observer can work within. No? That's the point. So there is no God as a third. If there were a God, he or she, no, a female God, like Inanna or Ishtar, for example, he or she would be a third order observer. But there is no third order observer. That's the point. So in this sense,
God does not throw Würfel thrices. This is an Einstein quote.
No, but interestingly, that's a good point. It's interesting to observe from the external point of view of philosophy that Einstein was not so fond of quantum physics. He was not ready to. He was not willing.
Working on the.
He was not willing to understand the metaphysical implications of quantum physics. In this sense, he remained a scientist of the 19th century in a certain way, or even in the sense that he believed that the physical law have their own existence, independently from any observer. The point is that if you agree with what comes from quantum physics, you discover laws. And you are needed as an observer in order to say there is a physical law. No? And this is the point whereas Einstein disagreed with his colleagues who created, who brought about what we call now quantum physics. But anyway, I come back to Luhmann. So there is no third order observers, there is only systems within which you have first and second order observers. This fact implies the fact that any system composed of first and second order observers can observe itself. The possibility of a second order of the existence of second order observers makes it possible for a system within which both first and second order observers work, makes it possible for a system, for any given system, to practice a sort of self-reflection. But this self-reflection does not imply any form of externality. You still remain within the system. The function of, in the strict sense of the term given by Luhmann, the function of any second order observer is that the existence, the presence, or better, the performativity, I would say, of a second order observer allows for any process of self-reflection within the system.
Yeah.
And this, when Luhmann speaks of system, of course, the system he has in mind is modernity, as I said previously, which is the system within which all of us are compelled in a certain way to work. No? Perhaps we could join the people who live in the Andaman Islands, but I'm not so sure that they want to share their life with us. So, or people, the Kanaki or other people who live inside the Amazon Urwald and so on. But anyway, what an observer of second order, or a second order observer sees is the paradox implied in any act of observation, in any operation of observation. The first order observer doesn't see the difference between him or herself and the world, because this difference is always implied by any act of observation, because to observe something or anything, whatever you want, implies that you create, you put into existence, so to say, the difference between you and what you are observing. And so you cannot manage this difference because you work within it. You always presupposes this difference. Which are the solutions? There is no solution, of course, according to Luhmann, what we call observe as sociologists, as artists, as philosophers. The only thing we can do is to observe the existence of paradoxes, and secondly, and further, we can observe the way in which any system, any given system, works with paradoxes. How does any system work with its own paradoxes? Through recursivity. Recursivity, that means to deploy the paradoxes a long time. I say deploy purposefully. No? It's a term that has to do with warfare, and that's why I have chosen it, because, I mean, if you study geopolitics, strategy, things like that, in that case, even before Luhmann, you have the opportunity to see forms of thought which are not strictly related to philosophy, but in a certain way they are, within which the necessity to deal with, to cope, to deal with paradoxes is present since the beginning. Because within war, any form of warfare, you do not know what the other is doing or is going to do. And you and your enemy are both within the same system, which is the world system, no? Within which wars, of course, since the beginning of the post-Neolithic era. So, which are the consequences we can find within this discourse? Useful consequences, first of all, in a philosophical perspective, in my opinion. The first consequence is that there is no foundation in the sense of Letzbegründung. The Letzbegründung, the ultimative grounding of both the existence of the world and the existence of truth concerning the world. This was the sense of this undertaken of classical philosophy, of classical metaphysics. Also, this dream of an ultimative grounding, I repeat it, both of the existence of the world and of the existence of formal sentences to which we can attribute a truth value. So this old form of grounding is not to be held anymore. It is not something we can dream of anymore. Of course, there are a lot of colleagues within the academia where we work that still continue to dream of this possibility of a Letzbegründung, because this is the way in which they can justify their existence within the academia itself.
It's possible, yeah.
In a certain way. Yeah, no, that's the point. Within the encyclopedia, there are some strange people, some crazy people, crazy in the clinical sense of the term, I mean, that are, because here you have a form of paranoia. Lacan wrote wonderful things about this connection between the dream of a Letzbegründung and the paranoid psychic attitude. No? There is still a lot of colleagues of us who are still who keep on dreaming of the possibility of a Letzbegründung, the ultimative foundation of the world, of reality in general, of the totality of being. But this is not possible anymore. But we are not lost in a certain way. We are lost in the processes of foundation. That's the point. We are lost in the necessity to ground anything, because this is the task of philosophy, this is the task of rationality, to find good grounds.
The new ground,
to deliver good grounds in order to justify the existence of knowledge, even from a biological perspective. Why do we need knowledge? Why do we need the truth as such? So, in order to accomplish this, to pursue the task of philosophy, we have to recognize the fact that we are involved in uninterrupted processes of foundation. But this means that the foundation itself is something contingent. You cannot arrive at an absolute foundation. This means that the transcendental perspective, and when I say transcendental, I refer not to Kant, I refer this term not to Kant, rather to Husserl, who is the author we have to read before reading Luhmann, because even if there are not so much references to Husserl's work within Luhmann's work, Luhmann himself admittedly said that Husserl is the first reference for him. Of course, many, many other authors are important for him. Bateson, second order cybernetics, Roche Ashby, theory of organizations, Herbert Simon, James Murch, and so on, Talcott Parsons, Max Weber among the sociologists. But the only really important philosophical reference for Niklas Luhmann was Edmund Husserl's phenomenology. And it is not by, this is important for me because phenomenology read through the lenses of Luhmann's system theory becomes what, how would I say it, how could I say it, becomes important for us, even if we are used to say that transcendental questions are not so important anymore for us, and so on. But transcendentality, the question of the transcendental stance, becomes important if you are ready to read Husserl's phenomenology as something that comes before Luhmann's system theory. If we put them together, not chronologically, but from a sheer theoretical point of view, we can understand why the transcendental question, the old transcendental question, is still important for us. Why it is important for us? Because the transcendental questions, the transcendental stance better, or the transcendental venue, I would say, perhaps, compels the philosopher to say what he or she is doing while doing it.
Yeah.
The transcendental question, redescribed, reframed through Luhmann's system theory, becomes the question of self-positioning. And this is important for post-colonial studies, gender studies, and so on and so on. Also, an important realm within the encyclopedia, within which phenomenology as such is not so much important, of course, but perhaps we should not forget that all what we are doing now in the present era, where we are so eager to transform our academic practice into something politically relevant, in order to understand why it is not only necessary to do that, but why it is even possible to do that, namely the fact that we have to account for our self-positioning within the theory we are bringing about. This reason comes from the correct way of reading Husserl's phenomenology. And this correct, I say it as a joke, of course, this correct way of reading Husserl comes from the way in which we are ready to get acquainted with Luhmann's system theory, within which paradoxes are so important. When Husserl met the paradoxes of his own theory, and he met them in the crisis, he was not so happy with that. He said, I have to admit that there are a blind spot, what Luhmann later called the blind spot. There is a blind spot in my phenomenology, but I'm a little bit unhappy with it. If you read The Crisis, there are statements like that. But he was honest enough in order to make place for the paradoxical construction of phenomenology. The second point is a point related to the existential meaning, I would say, if not the religious meaning of system theory. You can take the main books of Luhmann and read them as if they were guides to better life in a certain way, as if they were something like the Tao Te Ching or the exercises of Ignatius or things like that. Because what you can learn by reading Luhmann's system theory is the fact that you are contingent. Your position as an observer is one position among many, many, many others, included the position of taken one day perhaps by thinking machines. There are no thinking machines now, up to now, but in case that they come into existence, no, they will be observers like us within the same system, no, that encompasses all the possible forms of observers. And so in this sense, to get acquainted with your contingency, with what Freud named Vergänglichkeit, how would you say it in English? The fact that you are a finite being, the fact that you must die, that's the point, the fact that you must die, that death is implied in the same concept of life, no? This fact, this brute fact, is implied in this idea that you are an observer among others.
Yeah.
The last point, and then I come to the conclusion of what I wanted to bring to the table, to our discussion now, is the fact that we can, thanks to Luhmann's system theory, we can consider in a different way the encyclopedia you meant before. Mm-hmm. The system within which we all live as human beings now is modernity, as I said previously, but the system within which we all live as theorists, as people who write books, who give conferences, who practice theory, what we call theory, which is a practice among others, by the way. The system within which we all work is the encyclopedia. But so in this sense, the encyclopedia acquires a transcendental meaning, but in the sense said before, transcendental doesn't mean that it comes from the outside. We are within this system, and we all contribute to build it up in a certain way. So the encyclopedia itself becomes something contingent. This means that we can recognize the historicity of every form of knowledge, which is a very important point with huge political consequences, of course. This is not necessary to mention them now. But by recognizing the historicity of truth itself, of the concept of truth, we can practice the recursivity I was talking about previously. Mm-hmm. Our truth, because of course we suppose to say true things. No? It would be a performative contradiction, no? If we say what I'm saying is not true. We assume the truthfulness of our theories, of our speech, and so on. But this is a contingent act within the shared encyclopedia. And so in this sense, the encyclopedia becomes the political place within which it is possible to imagine new words, by recognizing at the same time that this act is a small act, because the most important revolutionary things, the most important innovations, the most important upheavals within the political system take place outside the academia, outside any universitarian institution, of course. We must be aware, I think, of the fact that our innovations have a very small range. But at the same time, we want to give our small contribution to the imagination of new form of words, of new forms of friendship and convivence among human beings. But the most important thing is that we recognize the contingent character of these small acts.
Thank you, Giovanni. I have lots of questions to you all. But obviously there is no possibility for philosophy to think itself as an act of foundation, as you said, at least in the traditional metaphysical sense. And I agree with the fact that system theory can be usefully used as a means to disengage phenomenology from its last metaphysical feature, which is a science of the cogito, in the end, which also implies that the foundation itself as a political place, it's the
encyclopedia, no, itself that becomes contingent. And in my view, D'Alembert and Diderot were perfectly aware of it.
Absolutely, absolutely. We
So
tend
yeah.
to forget that.
One could say, did I misunderstand? Please say it. The encyclopedia is the training ground for human intelligence.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
And the encyclopedia encompasses both human beings and artifacts. That's very important.
This is
point.
why
That's very important.
this
Books,
kind of,
for example,
this
without
kind of-
the books we read, we cannot improve our intelligence. No?
this kind of opposition makes, or this juxtaposition might make sense. The encyclopedia as the training ground for human intelligence, opposite to the training grounds through which ChatGPT-4 and all the other comrades are going through the digital, because...
In my view, the encyclopedia is the first form of cyborg.
Yeah, exactly.
It is a cyborg.
Okay,
Made
then I
of
understood
human
you right.
intelligence
Yeah.
and shared mental models whose form is not only immaterial, is material as well. But I'm not saying that because I share the idea of what now is called extended cognition. No? I would say that every form of cognition is embedded better in broader contexts, and one of them is the encyclopedia. For us, is the most important one.
I think.
But for normal people, for people who are not engaged in theory or things like that, the common sense is the first form of shared mental models transmitted from generation to generations and so on.
So you could speak of encyclopedia as a sort of externalization,
Yes,
as you
yes.
said, of memory.
One of the many forms of externalization.
Intelligence, as you say, Siegfried.
As you said, yes.
Intelligence,
Yes.
yeah, as you say. Yeah.
What's very interesting is that the concept of encyclopedia has existed very famously actually since the early modern period, and yet there is this tension that is never resolved really, even with people like the great genius Leibniz. He has this idea of ars universalis and the general science, which would record everything, but always in a very static manner. And the question of contingency in the face, the question, this ideal of an absolute is always very badly negotiated by Leibniz and his fellow philosophers. They can never overcome the tension between the contingency of the world, of time and so on, and this ideal of a beautiful encyclopedia which would encompass everything. But I wanted also to mention the fact that everything you've mentioned is actually very much reflected in the thought of Hans Blumenberg, on especially the question of observation. I mean, and something I've noted in my own work about him too is the constant interplay between inside and outside, and the self being able to, and he's very unique on that level, being able to take the moment to distance oneself, within go inside, be immersed in the framework, whilst at the same time being aware that it is merely a contingent framework which will evolve over time, and that's obviously not so easy for many people to navigate that, including the awareness and the recognition that truths and our grounding itself is contingent and evolves over time. Yeah, I thought it was very
I'm not sure.
Blumenberg was another phenomenologist. We should not forget that as well, no?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's the same source, Husserl. Yeah, Blumenberg draws on Husserl too.
But on the other hand, I just would like to ask the question, or perhaps the question is paradox already, if we cannot try to think that this third order of observation is possible, not through our biological existence, but through machines, through models. This is what simulations are able to do. They can simulate, they can play the role of the third observer, and of course modeling the second and the first observer. This is possible, and this would be the reason why I asked this question is to put in more the the experimental and perhaps the playful side, the side of the impossible into the game, because there are possibilities or impossibilities for artists and intellectuals to work on this kind of impossibilities. I'm sorry, I'm stuttering a little bit, but you know, with people like Bloomberg, we can have a long discussion about Niklas Luhmann. I never understood why Niklas Luhmann is so famous in other countries. In Germany, he has not a very strong position, and one reason is that already quite early in the 1970s, some of the historians of sciences made absolutely clear, listen guys, this is no system theory. This is something different. System theory, which is a mathematical subdiscipline, is not what Luhmann is doing. He's doing. He realized an adaptation of system theory, but you can't call this system theory anymore because it's not consistent, and so on and so on and so on. There are a lot of critics of that, and I studied at the technical.
But the fact that it's not consistent is a good point.
Yeah, of course.
But even from a mathematical point.
Exactly.
I'm just telling you, because this discussion took place in the 70s. I studied there at the 70s at the Technical University, and I grew up with that. So McLuhan was for me always I read him, but it was also at the same time something like Bloomberg is of course a very fascinating thinker. Technik als Selbstbehauptung, als Selbstermächtigung. These are very important concepts, but they are also very limited. Again, I come back to this idea of a playful and experimental relation to technology. With Bloomberg's term, Selbstbehauptung, Selbstermächtigung, you can't address this other possibilities or also impossibilities in everyday life, to play, to challenge the systems, and do something quite different with them, not expected, ambiguous, and so on and so on.
I would disagree with that.
Yeah?
Let me play for a moment the role of the ontologist. Whom I'm not an ontologist. I am, as a phenomenologist, I'm used to move myself in the interplay between ontology and epistemology. I think that transcendental philosophy meant in the sense of Husserl means this interplay between ontology and epistemology. The continuous self-questioning of the subject who is responsible for the constitution of an ontology, so to say. But let me play for a moment the role of the ontologist. All the machines we are talking about heavily depend on an algorithm, and the algorithm is the creation of a human mind. So I don't see any possibility to create, to give place to a third-order observer. The machine we are talking about is another second-order observer.
But machines are now writing their own algorithms and their own codes.
Exactly.
And actually, there is absolutely, and that's praised as the way forward. In fact, to the criticism of people like Gary Marcus, quite famously and quite very recently. I would like to come back
But
quickly.
they still depend on human interactions. Those human interactions that we need in order to create new words, to imagine new words, and so on. So the ontological basis remains the same.
Yes, but from an operative level, there is a margin or a relative autonomy of machine exactly in calculating, combining. Yes.
Can I come back quickly to the point of Hans Blumenberg?
Yep.
And I think, on the technical, he wrote a few essays on the technical question, which are limited, and I agree with you on there. However, he wrote a beautiful, incredible text on the aesthetic, where he refers back to the text of Paul Valéry, finding that object on the beach.
Yep.
And this is an incredible text because he talks, and this is a celebration of variety, ambiguity, that object that we cannot pinpoint, that we cannot identify. And I find actually Blumenberg, even though on some questions he may seem a bit narrow, he is actually the thinker of nuance and circumtuity and ambiguity. And actually, I think that this is the case why people like him. And I saw that when I was working on Leibniz, like Luhmann, Leibniz, Blumenberg, they all fail to fit in neatly into categories easily, and they are very, and people do not like that. It's very unsettling for people. They are those who challenge the thresholds, those who challenge the categories.
Yeah, no, fine. I agree with that. There's, by the way,
That's why, that's the reason why it is not so, you have no payoff. It is so dangerous for you as a member of the academia if you deal with these authors. No? The colleagues come to us and say, you are not a true philosopher.
Yes, obviously.
Because you write books about
You don't fit
Blumenberg and
in.
Luhmann. No?
You don't fit in.
You don't fit in.
You know,
You don't fit
I mean,
in.
something
Yes.
we didn't talk about, we only talked about paradox from the perspective of the observer, but I work on the paradox from a question of logic, actually. And this is what's been happening, and we didn't mention Bertrand Russell, but, a lot of the problem and what I'm working on currently is, is logic exhausted? And is this why we have been degenerating, the models have been degenerating, these extremely logical models have been degenerating under the influence of, because of excess, into these crazy ideological machines. So,
A good question.
No, but let me just one little reaction, because there is a slight misunderstanding. I admire Bloomberg a lot. My point was that I definitely did not articulate that very well. That his idea of Selbstbehauptung and Selbstermächtigung is a limited thing. There are a lot of other things in his writings which I like a lot, and you described that perfectly. But this idea of Selbstbehauptung, Selbstermächtigung is, of course, very close to the biggest fear of those people who do not really deal intensively with artificial intelligence, but write about it and speak about it. And this is the fear of the Selbstermächtigung of the machines. The eschatological figure of what you can call in English a technological singularity. And this is, and Diego yesterday addressed the whole very complex subject of subjectivity. We have urgently to find new ideas about that, which are not sticking into the limitations of modernity, of European modernity, but which are much more open. And then also these kind of fears of the Selbstbehauptung, the Selbstermächtigung of the machine or the human being and so on, can be dissolved. This is my opinion.
This is not my point, because I think that every possible form of every new attempt to create a new form of subjectivity, a new feature for what we mean with the concept of subjectivity, is another form of Selbstbehauptung. That's the point, and this is a point made very clearly by Blumenberg. No?
Yeah, that's a very European thought. I'm sorry. No, that's a very European thought.
I consider it from a Buddhistic or a Taoistic perspective.
Yes, also because Selbstbehauptung can be accounted as a sort of, in a Luhmannian sense, as the act of distinction itself is not the auto-position of the subject, but the act of distinguishing, tracing a line between, again, outside and inside and outside, is a sort of position which coincides with the difference between, the difference. The differential of the act of distinction. But I definitely agree with you, Siegfried. We need to find something which is not a metaphysics, which is neither the metaphysics of a cogito nor metaphysics of the object, or of an ontology, but something in between. That's why I think Spinoza is still...
Chaos, you know, I'm always in my thoughts always close to artists, and the chaos theoretician and physicist I was talking about, Otto Rössler, he had a wonderful expression when he talked about the cogito. He says, cogito, therefore I sum. Ich denke, deshalb summe ich. No? Beautiful. That's of course the expression of a passionate quantum physicist. and why not summing more? There are so many possibilities of summing, and summing does not mean that we are silly or that we are turning nuts or something like that. And I'm interested in this summing. This and
Point.
Okay. Obviously,
Let me shortly explain how I try to introduce these subjects within the academia, and in a way that I consider perhaps mistakenly artistic. First, I read Nagarjuna. I've been reading Nagarjuna the whole time, but being impossible to give lectures on Nagarjuna, because then, do you know Sanskrit? No, sorry, I do not. I cannot read in Sanskrit. No? Being impossible to do that, then I give lectures on Husserl, where I find the same results, the same philosophical results. There is no ego. There are only intersubjectivity for Husserl. There is no subject for Luhmann. There are only observing systems among which we find ourselves. No? We can occupy the position of an observer. This is subjectivity for Luhmann. No? But for Husserl as well, it was impossible to say that there is an ego, there is a cogito. The time is the only thing that
I'd say that
exists.
Luhmann is a bit more radical.
No,
you don't
because
think
if
so.
you take the lessons from 95 on the internal time consciousness, there are only processes. No?
Yeah.
I wonder why we always quote Whitehead while talking about ontology or process. But the first form of ontology or process is to be found in phenomenology.
Phenomenology, yeah.
There is Zeitlichkeit. No? So we have to find new ways to introduce, where we work, where we concretely work, where we carry on our work, new forms of discourses. For you it's easier because you work with artists. For those who do not work with artists, it's much more difficult, I think.
And the conditions of possibility for new forms of discourses, including
because,
in AI and so on. Yeah.
They see
Because the
how-
institutions are constraints.
Absolutely, they are conservative, and
Exactly.
whereas you see how the Spinoza's paradoxical notion of subject is put in practice, that is, the idea for which substance is always modalized in something else, is the difference, the process of differentiation. So, and you see it practically. So thank you for being here, for taking part in this
Thank you, everyone.
Very
clandestine.
thank you. It was a pleasure.
This session of
Enjoy
our
it.
clandestine
Right.
talks. And I'll bring
Thanks
with
to
me
meditate.
the image of the Leave Me Alone box, Claude Shannon Leave Me Alone box, which is beautiful, absolutely beautiful. It exemplifies perfectly this, paradoxical, orthopoietic character of communication, which is useless in the end,
It's
as you
used,
said.
but it's beautiful.
Yeah,
It's a thought machine.
yeah.
It's not a thinking machine, it's
box.
a thought machine.
Yeah.
So what happens with what we have just done?
I loved your image of the, like going back in space, and I was about, to, I would have liked to interject, and you even look like a crazy scientist.
Yeah, that's what when I went to China, to Beijing, into the Science Museum, there was a huge sculpture of Einstein. Wild hair, grey wild hair, and I was wearing a waistcoat and a suit and a tie. I had no moustache. But there were thousands of kids in this huge museum, school kids, and they were all running behind. Einstein! Let's take a photo. Let's take a photo.
You see?
Nice to see you. Let's make a photo. Very funny.
Thank you. Thank you.
So what happens with with the recordings.